Sadashiv sir?
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Can you see my desktop?
Yeah.
No,
good evening.
I'll make you the presenter. 1 minute. स्वानंद सर को बोलना पड़ेगा एक बार बंद करने, 1 सेकंड। नहीं, आपका ही है सर, आपका स्क्रीन नहीं आया सर अभी तक।
हाँ,
शेयर कीजिए सर। हेलो
Sadashiv.
We are not seeing your screen, sir.
Can you see it now? Can you see my screen?
सालपेकर सर दिख रहा है आपको सदाशिव सर का स्क्रीन?
नहीं, मेरे को नहीं दिख रहा है। मेरे को अभी भी स्वानंद लिख
नहीं ना सर। हाँ वही 1 मिनट। सदाशिव
उनको बंद करने लगाना पड़ेगा तेरे को।
हाँ सर, मैं बंद करने लगाता हूँ उनको। 1 सेकंड। सर हेलो सर, आपका वो वेबिनार बंद कीजिए सर, वहां से आपका वेबिनार पूरा बंद कर दीजिए सर। हाँ सर, पूरा बंद कर दीजिए अभी, क्योंकि इधर सदाशिव सर का आ नहीं रहा है। 1 मिनट। हाँ या सदाशिव सर अब दीजिए सर। नाउ गिव योर स्क्रीन।
या दिख रहा है अभी?
हाँ, अभी दिख रहा है।
या वी गॉट
Okay. Right. Can you see
yeah,
now?
we saw your webcam also. Yes.
Yes. So start my presentation. So thank you very much and welcome to today's webinar. And I'm fortunate enough to have a second chance of doing this. Who is chairing the session? Yeah.
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar. It's always been a pleasure to listen to Sadashiv or Dr. Sadashiv Bhole, a young dynamic urologist, not only from the city of Nagpur, but from the central India. He's also a fitness freak, and as you all know that he's going to talk about urinary tract infections today. We all sitting in this audience have been treating urinary tract infection, and all of us have a lot of queries about treating urinary tract infection. Let's listen to Dr. Sadashiv Bhole. He's going to talk about urinary tract infections. Sadashiv.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your kind words and a brief introduction. So, urinary tract infection is very important because it touches every clinician, whether it's a practicing physician, surgeon, gynecologist, of course, urologist, nephrologist. So, it is one thing which is very common, and it in clinical practice it is very important because there is no specialty which is basically spared of a patient of UTI. So what I would be doing in this, because I realize this is a presentation for general surgeons and residents as well and consultants. So my job will be to touch on the fundamentals of urinary tract infection. And there are a few problems and few misconceptions regarding urinary tract infection, asymptomatic bacteria and asymptomatic pyuria, which I would try to make it absolutely crystal clear to the audience. So remember this, that urinary infection is by definition as an inflammatory response of the urothelium to the bacterial invasion, right? So this is a basic kind of a definition which we have from the. Can you just give me 1 minute? I just have to check my screen. Again, I'm seeing Swanand. All right. So it is defined as an inflammatory response of urothelium to bacterial invasion, and that is usually associated with bacteriuria and pyuria, right? I'm just getting this is coming into my okay. Now I'm good, right? So this is a Campbell Walsh textbook of urology definition. Now look at this definition very, very carefully. UTI is not bacterial or pyuria. UTI is defined as an inflammatory response. It is a response of the urothelium and the body, the human body, to bacterial invasion, and that is associated with bacterial infusion. So this definition is very important. This particular word, that inflammatory response of urothelium, is urinary tract infection, right? So I will making it more clear, because this is somewhere which many of us are making a mistake in treating our patients on day-to-day basis. I'm sorry. Right. So what are the risk factors of UTI? One is the anatomical factor. The commonest anatomical factor is that it is more common in women than men, because of the shorter urethral course, because the vaginal and the anal area is close to the urethra, and so forth and so forth. Lower socioeconomic class is more important. In women who are having multiparity, then patients of sickle cell trait, and the most important factor in our society today is diabetic mellitus. We see so many diabetics with urinary tract infection. Neurogenic bladder due to some reason, say a patient who has been operated for spinal trauma, for spinal surgery. Structural abnormality of urinary tract. This would include right from phimosis to meatal stenosis to stricture urethra, prostatic obstruction, any urinary obstruction or abnormality, in the sense that vesicular reflux, you can say, or epispadias trophy complex. So all these structural abnormalities which are congenital, acquired in childhood and adulthood, make the patient prone to develop UTI. One more risk factor is, for no obvious reason, if the patient is having history of previous UTI, then that patient is more at risk. Urinary calculus disease. Stones make the patient prone to develop infection. As I told you, insulin reflux, and in women, one more physiological state, that is pregnancy. In pregnancy, why in a normal physiological state a person should be more prone to UTI? That is because of the hormonal changes. That is because of progesterone, there is relaxation of smooth parts of the urinary tract, there is decreased peristalsis, dilatation of pelvis in the ureter, there is VUR, there is stasis of urine, predisposed to infection. It also unmasks latent diabetes. Then it also increases the blood flow to the kidney. The GFR increases during pregnancy. So all these factors taken together make a woman more prone to develop UTI during pregnancy. In both the sexes, in male and female both, bladder obstruction of any kind will make the patient extremely vulnerable to UTI. And this is important because this is one of the commonest subset of patients which we are seeing in our surgical practice. It basically increases intravesical pressure. Now let me tell you that our bladder and urinary system is a low pressure, high flow system. That is, the bladder generates a low pressure of 35 to 40 centimeters of water, and the patient should have a good stream at that particular pressure. Whenever the bladder has to put more pressure, like it goes to about more than 40 centimeters or 60 centimeters of water, when there is this obstruction, there can be urinary stasis, there can be increase in the pressure, and this high pressure, low flow states make the person more prone to develop UTI. And this is exactly the physiology we see in bladder outlet obstruction of all kinds. Now, if we divide UTI, one of the classifications, the clinical classification, is asymptomatic bacteriuria, where the patient has only urine shows bacteria and it's asymptomatic. Or it's symptomatic infection. They can be classified as acute urethritis, then prostatitis, cystitis, pyelonephritis, so on and so forth. So let me touch on one of the most important topic in UTI for non-urologists and non-nephrology friends is something which is called asymptomatic bacteria. Now remember, this is very fundamental, and everybody among us has to make it crystal clear today that what is ASB, asymptomatic bacteriuria. Does it need treatment? Does it need further course of follow-up? So I would make it very clear, this topic is very close to my heart because it's very passionate. Because I see so many people taking antibiotics, particularly women, for years together, months together, and they are being unfairly treated for a condition which does not require any treatment. That is asymptomatic bacteria. Now, by definition, bacteria is more than 100,000 colony-forming units per ml, or one or more pathogens in 2 consecutive midstream samples. By definition, it is 2 consecutive midstream. Only 1 midstream sample is not important. Or if you are able to catheterize the patient in a very aseptic way and take a sample from the bladder, then even the one catheter urine specimen is adequate to name the patient as a bacteriemic patient. Now, we call it asymptomatic if the bacteria are present in the urine in these coliform units, but the patient does not have any symptoms of it. Now, asymptomatic bacterial pregnancy is very important because it is commonly seen, its prevalence is 2 to 7%, and if untreated, 20 to 40% of these pregnant women is going to have cystitis and pyelonephritis. So, when treated, the incidence falls from 40% to 1%. So, this particular subset of patient, like pregnancy, this is important for a gynecologist, but it is also important for us because we do tend to see patients who are in full trimester of pregnancy and who are coming with lower tract symptoms and severe symptoms of UTI, and that is why we have to see that AIDS in pregnancy is a special group. Now, what are the organisms which can cause colonization and cause bacteriuria and infection? The commonest are gram-negative bacteria, that is E. coli 75 to 80%, Proteus, Millivaris, Klebsiella 8 to 10%. So there are other less than 5% chances of infection because of Enterobacter species, then Pseudomonas, Coagulus negative staph, Streptococci, etc., etc. So gram-negative, mainly E. coli, Proteus, Klebsiella, and Pseudomonas. This is very important to remember. Now, do we do screening for bacteria, asymptomatic bacteria? Yes, we do. In which subset we do screening? One is pregnant patients. Second, patients who are having artificial heart valves. Third, patients who are having device, like a patient who has been operated for TCAR or THL. He is having an implant inside. So in such patients, we must be screening these patients for asymptomatic bacteria. Remember, the patient is asymptomatic. So we have to do basic urine testing and urine culture in the patient's follow-up, even though the patient does not have symptoms in these subsets. Only 3 subsets. One is patient with pregnancy. Then second is patient with heart valves or implants, and third is immunocompromised patients. Any immunocompromised patient has to be screened for asymptomatic bacteria. Now, screening is also mandatory for patients who are having recurrent UTI, renal disease like reflux nephropathy, structural neuropathic abnormalities, a patient of neurogenic bladder, for example, renal calculi, diabetes, sickle cell disease, etc., etc. Now, investigation-wise, if you see, if you call bacteriuria, asymptomatic bacteriuria, or urine infection, all 3, then urine culture is the gold standard for diagnosis of bacteriuria. Let's decide first bacteriuria. Then we decide whether the patient is infected or the patient is asymptomatic. This is how we have to do it. Now, one of the most important issues in diagnosing these patients and treating them in future is a microbiological report of your microbiology lab. And one of the requests which came to me through Yogesh was that what is the correct way to collect a sample? This was a question which was asked, so I have to make it absolutely clear. Now, it is a clean catch stream sample. So the patient, whether a male is or a female, the male is asked to retract his prepuce to the best of his abilities. Sometimes it is difficult in a patient who is having phimosis, but most of them can do it. You know that some of our patients are certain patients who have not retracted their prepuce for months together. There's a lot of smegma collection on that. So this prepuce, which is retracted, the gland has to be cleaned with a sterile saline swab. We have to give a sterile saline swab to the patient, a sterile pad soaked with saline, and ask them to clean it after pulling down the prepuce. The same thing, women have to clean up their vaginal labia before giving the sample. Then they give a midstream sample, it's a clean cat sample. So the patient does not touch that particular container, which is ideally a ETO sterile container, a plastic container. It should not touch anywhere around, and it should be a clean cat sample. And it's the midstream. So first the patient is allowed to void, some urine is discarded, and then the midstream sample is caught. Sample is centrifuged, and then we use different culture media. Now, one more important point, that because we place so much importance to this particular investigation, it is imperative that you have access to a good microbiology lab. That is number 1. Number 2, there are good automated machines available now which give you rapid culture results, Biomerics, for example. Third important point is that our microbiology lab should have the relevant discs. Now, if we are having a patient who is coming on OPD basis, and we are not testing him whether he is basically sensitive to that culture is sensitive to quinolones or nitrofurantoin, and we are giving reports of Targocid and meropenem, that doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, a patient who is in ICU and we do not have the list for say higher antibiotics like Targocid, meropenem, etc., then probably we are missing out, because once we send the culture of a sick patient, particular patient who is hospitalized for severe infection, we need accurate reports, we need good reports for good antibiotic targeted treatment. Empirical treatment will be started immediately on admission, but we need a good microbiological report for culture report for accurate treatment, precise treatment. Urine dipstick is something which we do in urine routine microscopy just to see the presence of nitrite or leukocytes. Nitrite basically tells us that there are bacteria in the urine, and leukocytes will tell us whether there are white blood cells. Now, by definition, urine routine microscopy, more than 5 leukocytes per hypoid is significant in male. More than 10 leukocytes per hypoid in women. So more than 5 in male is called pyuria, more than 10 in female is called pyuria. Now, what is our policy of investigation? We do basic urine analysis and culture. That is our baseline whenever we think of urinary tract infection. We do a baseline hemogram. We want to see whether there is leukocytosis, whether the patient is having any increase in the total leukocyte count. We do blood sugar special of diabetes. Sometimes it is just a word of caution for all of you. I'm telling you, do not depend on one blood sugar report. We have seen patients, young patients, 20 to 24 years old, also coming with diabetes, not diagnosed previously with severe UTIs. So it was, and there are certain patients where you do a random sample, that blood sugar that time is normal. But that is normal because of relative hypoglycemia and because of sepsis. And once we see the patient later on in follow-up, the patient has a flow with diabetes. So do not depend on only one sample of blood sugar. We also add HbA1c to see the last 90 days of urine in a suspected patient. And in some patients, we do 1 or 2 times blood sugar more. Preferably fasting and post-meal is better. So, and we also assess kidney function tests, serum creatinine, blood urea, and electrolytes. Sonography, KUT, is a very important investigation. Then again, one word of caution, mistakes which I see and everybody must have observed, that we do USG abdomen. And our radiologists do not do post-surgical residue in USG abdomen. That is an important piece of investigation. In a woman of young age, old age, man of any age, this is a very important investigation. One has to tell the radiologist if they are dealing with any kind of urology case, forget it only about infection, post-void residue, he has to basically report. Then he has to report a pre-void also. So pre-void is the patient has say 430 cc urine, post-void is 130 cc. So that helps you deciding whether the patient is having a stagnation of urine. If the patient has no post-void residue, then that puts the case in an uncomplicated scenario. If the patient has post-void residue, then you basically think about blood rotate obstruction. So USG abdomen, even if you are doing for a case of urology or any urinary infection, one must test to the radiologist to have a post-void residue. Otherwise, that particular sonography finding is totally inconclusive and is of no use to us. Now, the second common mistakes which we see in most of the radiological reports is they will look at cystitis. There is nothing like cystitis. Cystitis is a clinical diagnosis. A radiologist should report thickening of the urinary bladder. Thickening may be because of the detrusor hypertrophy, it may be because of the pulmonary hypertrophy. It is the clinician who will decide whether it is cystitis or not. So these are very important issues. Third important point is mild hydronephrosis. Now, mild hydronephrosis on sonography needs to be investigated further. It might be a small stone in the mid-urethra which is not seen on ultrasound. So many are missed on ultrasound. So in such patients, whenever we are suspecting of the patient complaining of flank pain, it is always better not to depend on USG KUT as an investigative modality or as an absolute modality. One has to go for a plain CT. Plain CT is a very simple investigation. It will give you a 100% reliability and sensitivity of 99.9% whether there is presence of stone. Now imagine a patient coming to you with pyelonephritis and you're treating him conservatively with antibiotic only to find out later that he had mid-ureteric stone which was not seen because of the bowel in front, and somebody else picked it up on CT. So ultrasound is for screening. Whenever we suspect that there is a patient who might have an obstructive stone somewhere, his CT has to be done. Number two important point is that never depend on only sonography. Many times sonography is absolutely normal. We see findings on CT. For example, let's say some small subcapsular collection below the kidney in severe pyelonephritis. Emphysematous pyelonephritis can be missed on USG. So these are very important imaging investigations. So basic investigation is USG, but you have to many times do a CT scan of the KUB region. Or some people would like to call it CT urography. I would call it a CT KUB region. So CT KUB region, if a patient's creatinine is normal, it is better to go to contrast. If the patient's creatinine is elevated, it is always better to do with without contrast. It will give you the presence of a stone or absence of the stone or radiopaque density. Very important point. Now, do we need to manage all patients of ASB? No. Where do we see ASB? ASB is asymptomatic bacteria. You should never treat asymptomatic bacteria. Asymptomatic bacteria is presence of bacteria in urine. Asymptomatic pyuria is presence of pustules in urine. What is the definition of UTI? It is basically inflammatory response of urothelium to invading microorganisms. It is not bacterial pyuria, which might result in bacterial pyuria, right? The inflammatory response might result in bacterial pyuria. So pyuria can be there in a patient of stone, in a patient of diabetes, in a patient of tuberculosis, in a patient who has had a urological procedure, in a patient who had catheter, who had stent. So many reasons are there. So we need not give antibiotic to all the patients of this pyuria. If the patient has symptoms, like patient has flank pain, fever, chills, if the patient is complaining of severe dysuria, scalding pain, frequency, urgency, then yes, symptoms are there, pyuria is there, bacteria plus in culture, then antibiotic treatment. Only asymptomatic bacteria patients are the worst sufferers because for years together they are given nitrofurantoin, quinolones by various kinds of physicians and doctors, and somehow the itch reduces and the patient comes back. He becomes so paranoid that he comes back every 17 days and says, "Doctor, वो 20 हो गए थे, अभी 40 हो गए, अभी 150 हो गए." The patient will not have any symptoms. So this is very commonly I've seen in diabetic patients. So avoid treating if the patient does not have symptoms. If at all they have to be treated, we know that I will not go into much of the details regarding treatment with quinolones, cephalosporins, nitrofurantoin, etc., etc. I will. We all know these treatments, these standard treatments. So complications, if not treated, is in high group patients, right? High risk patients like pregnancy. We are talking about pregnancy here. Like it can result in frank cystitis, pyelonephritis, peritoneal IUGS. In patients with heart valve, it can cause endocarditis. In patients with implants, it can cause basically infection. And in patients who are having immunocompromised function, patient can have sepsis. So whenever we treat any urinary infection, the urine culture should be repeated after 7 days, and prophylaxis sometimes is given. We give nitrofurantoin or quinolone low dose for 21 to almost 1 month. In pregnancy, also nitrofurantoin can be given, but in other patients we can give quinolone also. And these are some of the behavioral methods you see which we always advise patients. We do not advise use of soap for cleaning private parts in women now. We wash is something which we use because soap is highly alkaline in nature and it basically damages the bacteria, the commensal bacteria in the vagina, and that can cause repeated infections in vaginitis. So we advise them to clean it only with plain water. If people that to use, they can use wash. So now, symptomatic UTIs, if we look into it, we look into two categories. Like lower tract, we have acute cystitis, urethritis, prostatitis. When we go to the upper tract, it's acute pyelonephritis. So this is the pathogenesis of a UTI. So basically, most of the UTIs can start from the urethra and ascend up towards the kidney and cause pyelonephritis and acute kidney injury. However, there are patients who get infection through hematogenous fits. And one of the important points which we are finding in contemporary urological practices, we are getting patients who are young women and men who are coming with absolutely no comorbid condition, no diabetes, nothing. Children who are studying MBBS, who are studying second, third year engineering, young, robust men and women who are coming with severe acute pyelonephritis to the tune that they come with hypotension and we have to admit them in ICUs and give them very aggressive treatments. So this is something probably because we are because of the antibiotic abuse, we are getting more and more bugs, and we are living in an era of super bugs. So urinary tract infection should never be underestimated in any age group. So acute cystitis, these are very short things. I just make you, these are fundamentals which I try to allow. So this is basically an infection of the bacteria or bacteria and the infection related to the bladder. Inflammation, that is why cystitis. There is no evidence of systemic illness. So basically gram-negative bacteria are the commonest. Occasionally we get fungal infection like Candida albicans. And we have a patient who presents with frequency urgency, dysuria, nocturia. Most of the times hematuria is because of cystitis. So we ask them the history, whether it was associated with burning, dysuria, and then hematuria. Then it is likely a case that it is basically a patient of cystitis. Pain in the lower abdomen, fever, vomiting. Usually there is no systemic symptoms. Fever, vomiting is usually secondary. Same investigations we do for any UTI, which I have already enlightened you. And these are the drug treatments. Let me tell you in a nutshell, when a patient of cystitis comes, if the patient is not having very severe symptoms and we treat it on OPD basis, our first line of treatment is usually a combination of cephalosporin and quinolone, or nitrofurantoin and quinolone. Usually, I don't prefer to mix nitrofurantoin with quinolone because it causes a lot of nausea and vomiting in patients. Most of them cannot basically tolerate that particular dose, that combination. So a cephalosporin coupled with either nitrofurantoin or a quinolone as an empirical starting therapy is the best treatment. Now, another confusion which I want to make it clear that Uritop, Mifpran, all these are sustained release nitrofurantoin tablets. So you need not prescribe these tablets 3 times a day. The dose is 100 mg twice a day in an adult in quinolone. Levofloxacin can be given in 500, 750 milligram dose. Ofloxacin can be given in 500, 1 gram dose also. But these are treatments which have to be coupled with symptomatic treatment. We have to give patients, some of them get acidity also, so we have to give them pantoprazole or rabeprazole. And we have to give symptomatic treatment. If the patient is having frequency, we have to give them sulfasalazine or tolterodine. We have to give them a alkalizer to decrease the urinary burning. We also have to give them sometimes anti-inflammatory paracetamol or sometimes NSAID in patients who are having severe symptoms of inflammation. So these combinations are used as empirical treatment. Antibiotic, one antacid, syrup, alkalizer, and paracetamol or NSAIDs is first treatment. In the first visit, we get all the investigations done. Never ever think that it is simple UTI and try to omit one investigation. It is very embarrassing when the patient does not respond and goes to our colleague and we find out that sonography was done for dysuria and cystitis and the patient had a bladder stone. So that is a worst scenario. So a patient always basically earns the ultrasound when he comes to your clinic with these symptoms of acute cystitis. So it is always better to investigate them. So let's not go into cephalosporin. I'll just breeze through it because I know we have another presentation. So acute pyelonephritis is infection and infection of the renal.
Yes, Bole sir, just interruption. We might not be able to get Swanand sir online today.
Okay.
We might not be
So
because it's a computer issue.
So you can go.
Yeah,
so
you can go.
you have plenty of time to talk about urine tract infection.
So here I'll try to keep it short so that we have maximum time for interaction. Acute pyelonephritis is infection and inflammation of the renal parenchyma, calyces and pelvis in the presence of systemic illness. Now let's differentiate what is acute pyelonephritis, what is pyonephrosis, what is infected hydronephrosis. These are certain things which are very confusing to most of the people. Pyelonephritis is inflammation of the renal cortex. And associated with it, there can be inflammation of the pelvic system. Pyonephrosis is a condition where the renal pituitary system is failed first, that is pyonephrosis. It is usually secondary to obstruction. Infected hydronephrosis is some term which is in between these, just before pyonephrosis, I would say, where the patient has had, let's say, obstruction for a long period of time and then he got infection. But we do not try to use infected hydronephrosis as the term. We usually use either pyelonephritis when there is a renal parenchyma function and pyonephrosis even when there is infected hydronephrosis. So it should be absolutely clear to us. Now, in acute pyelonephritis, usually there is no hydronephrosis or minimal hydronephrosis. In pyelonephrosis, there is hydronephrosis because it is usually secondary to some kind of obstruction. Pyelonephritis usually does not require immediate drainage of some sort like degestant and PCL. Pyelonephrosis usually warrants some kind of drainage, either percutaneously drainage or degestation. So these are the differences. Now, incidence is basically 1 to 4% of all pregnant women. It's common in women more, in less. It's around 1 to 2% in men. And it's a big problem when the patient is pregnant and she comes with pyelonephritis. So this is for basically some data for gynecologists for acute pyelonephritis. But in men also it's not uncommon. And we have seen very severe pyelonephritis in patients of diabetes. Organisms usually are gram-negative organisms like E. coli, Klebsiella proteus. Pseudomonas also accounts for about 5 to 15%. Gram-positive bacteria like Cocci fecalis and Staph and Strepto account for the remainder. This is very important to basically remember gram-positive infection in patients who are critically ill and in ICUs, because most of the times our antibiotic treatment and therapy is concentrated on gram-negative bacilli. So we many times miss this. Also remember that fungal infection, fungal pyelonephritis is very common in these patients who are compromised immunologically, who are sickly and on dialysis, and who are patients who are diabetic for a long time. So these three modalities have to be kept in mind when we have to basically think about treating. Now, as we decided that most of the times bacterial pyelonephritis is secondary because of the bacteria ascents from below to the kidney through the ureter. There can be hematogenous spread and there can be lymphatic spread as well. So the signs and symptoms of this particular disease is that the patient presents usually with high-grade fever. There will be chills and rigors. Sometimes there is hypothermia as well. Patients present with anorexia, nausea, malaise, vomiting, extreme tiredness, exhaustion. And these are secretions because of secretions of endotoxins. There are specific symptoms like if the left kidney is inward, then there will be left flank pain, costovertebral tenderness, etc., etc. So you can localize the patient or which kidney the infection is basically on clinical examination. There are certain patients who present with bilateral pyelonephritis also. Now investigations are the same investigations, but in a critically ill patient we also send blood culture. Now the blood culture is usually sent as a 20 cc sample from an antehumeral vein or the femoral vein in a patient who is having rigors or during high-grade fever. That gives you the maximum yield. Blood culture is important in documenting that the patient is having severe systemic sepsis and bacteremia. Radiological investigations are USG. IVP is usually not done. We usually tend to do CT scans more. And if the patient is not having CKD or acute kidney injury, we basically do a contrast NRCT. Now, management of acute pyelonephritis almost usually 99% of the time we require hospitalization. And usually these patients require hospitalization if they are very sick in ICUs. Otherwise, we can have them admitted in a normal ward with very close monitoring, vital signs. We have to see whether we have to catheterize the patient to monitor the urine output. Always remember that these sick patients require catheterization, and it is very imperative on us to remember that the urine output is an excellent source of information to the clinician whether the patient is landing up in deep trouble. So kidney is the first organ to get infected and the last to recover during systemic sepsis. So we have to immediately start antimicrobial therapy, antipyretics to manage fever, X-ray chest if there is dyspnea or tachypnea. Nowadays we do CT chest straight away. We don't believe too much in X-ray chest because these are very serious ill patients, and if the patient is going for a CT of the abdomen or CT of cave region, we always try to do an X-ray chest at the same time. We do hematology and chemistry study in 40 hours. The patient has to be basically monitored for his CBC, neutrophils, and also his KFT and electrolytes. We wait till the report, earliest report we get whether the bacterial growth is there within 24, after 24 hours. We get the earliest culture report regarding some of the antibiotics in 48 hours and a complete report in 72 hours. So it basically helps us to give a targeted antimicrobial treatment to these patients. Now, these patients with acute pyelonephritis are patients which come largely under the urological domain. Why? Because most of these patients are missed if they are not seen by urologist. So one of the important factors when we have to see when these patients are there, see, mild hydronephrosis ultrasound can be a slurred renal papilla in a diabetic patient with obstruction, very bad condition. Can be a stone which is made on ultrasound. So with obstruction, you will not get moderate to hydronephrosis in every patient. Sometimes when the obstruction is usually young, it's not too old, and the patient presents with infection, you will get only mild hydronephrosis. That might be also non-obstructive hydronephrosis or PCS dilatation because of gram-negative bacteria or gram-negative infection. So whenever there is obstruction, one has to suspect obstruction. It is always better to overdiagnose obstruction in a critically ill patients with UTI and sepsis rather than to underdiagnose. Remember this always. A stent saves life. A PCN saves life. A connection around the kidney, the moment you put a percutaneous strain to the flank, will save a life. It will cut down morbidity. It will basically bring down the antibiotic therapy drastically, and it will give a much favorable result. So important point is to see where surgical treatment and surgical therapies are mandatory in these patients. Most of the patients are lying, no catheterization. We don't know whether the patient has phimosis, meatal stenosis, BXO, and then the patient after 48 hours is taken at night 11 o'clock when the patient goes in hypotension and shock, and then they find out that they cannot put a 6 French infrared tube because of meatal stenosis and BXO. So no, these patients require a thorough investigation. Infection needs a thorough clinical examination from head to toe, along with retraction of prepuce, seeing the meatus, seeing whether the urethra is normal or not. Very important points. Complete investigation. We should not miss anything. Now, as I told you that this will cause basically sepsis, renal dysfunction, acute kidney injury, ARDS, mild intubation on a ventilator, and can cause a lot of problems in the patient. So, complications in pyelonephritis are much more common when pyelonephritis occurs with diabetes, with CKD, in patients of undergoing dialysis, in patients who are pregnant. So these are very high-risk cases where one has to be very aggressive in treatment and management of these patients. And most of the times it is a teamwork, like we have to involve multiple specialists in treating this. Today we talk about teamwork in almost all the kind of management therapies because everybody has something to contribute. Because it's not only important for a clinician, the microbiological report you get is extremely important. The pathology report you get is extremely important. So all these specialties should come together and treat this patient as a teamwork. So as I told you, surgical management can be from cystoscopy because if sometimes it is not possible to put a catheter or a small short ureteroscopy, but cystoscopy we usually avoid in an active ill patient. If at all it is required, we do it at a later stage after the infection is controlled. If at all catheterization is required and it is difficult for peripheral catheterization, it is always better to put in a suprapubic catheter. Hardly takes 10 minutes, can be done under local anesthesia, can be done in the ICU, on the ICU bed itself, and it really helps. Instead of doing scopy. Scopy is mandated when we are thinking about certain rare diseases, rare things, rare conditions where there can be impacted stone in the urethra, stricture, which was made. Some diverticulum with narrow neck, which is basically a seat of infection. So for this, not in the acute phase. Cystoscopy is not the investigation or the thing which we do for in acute phase. But stenting and PCR insertion are undertaken as an emergency. In patients of stone infections, papilla, huge obstruction, stricture, unexplained PCS dilatation. These are something. Pay attention to these unexplained PCS dilatation. Very important. Patient has mild hydronephrosis. We have given medical reported hours of treatment, the intensivist is worried that the patient is not responding. Always over-treat rather than under-treat. Just takes 10 minutes in such a case to put a degestin from below. If it is an impacted stone, moderate to severe hydronephrosis, we are seeing that the stone won't go. Basic clinical surgical logic that it will be difficult to disimpact the stone. So always better not to manipulate anything from below. Directly turn the patient, do ultrasound guided PCM. Under local anesthesia can be done, small sedation can be given. Immediately you get culture from the kidney, send the reports always. Can get samples from the kidney for culture and sensitivity and gives you a very good path to treat the patient. Definitive surgery is usually done later if after all the infection is cured, after all the acute kidney injury is reversed, after the respiratory and cardiorespiratory system of the patient are stable. Acute urethritis is something which all of us will see in our clinical practice. It is reducing in clinical presentation. However, it's not reducing in incidence. We are seeing less of acute urethritis as a clinical presentation because the moment patient has the symptoms, they get some kind of antibiotic treatment from somewhere, or most of them they take it at home also. So we don't see a very classical symptoms. But classically, if you see that the patient will present with dyspnea, copious urethral discharge. Patient will present with staining of undergarments, copious urethral discharge. So it's basically a gram-negative infection. Gonococcal infection is very common in our country. Even though we are rampantly using quinolones and nitrofurantoin and cephalosporin in treatment of our patients. Initially, if you read the books, the treatment was 1 dose of fluoxetine, 1 gram of fluoxetine, 1 dose of levofloxacin. It doesn't work in my opinion today. At least 7 days of quinolone treatment has to be given. And we have to give this treatment to avoid secondary complications. Nitrofurantoin, maybe 1 week to 10 days, cephalosporin for 5 days. Usually, if the patient is having only urethritis, one should start with a single antibiotic. Take slide sample, treatment, gram staining can give immediate diagnosis. A culture can be done, but midstream culture here will not give you a proper So the initial phase of the urine sample, if you are suspecting urethritis, either you can take a direct swab from the meatus or the initial sample of the urine, not the midstream sample, because the midstream sample may be sterile, because that is a bladder sample. So urethritis has to be treated that way with quinolone, nitrofurantoin, or cephalosporins. Now, recurrence of infection is common, both covert or symptomatic, and it's to the tune of 30%. That is why follow-up culture and prophylaxis is important. Now, acute prostatitis can be present with scalding pain and dysuria. It can occur in all age groups. Prostatitis is not a disease only limited to old age group. In fact, it is commonly seen in young men also. So, certain questions are raised during prostatitis. Do we catheterize the patient? No, you should avoid catheterizing the patient as long as the patient has very, very severe lower retract symptoms or a patient goes in retention. Now, what is the modality to catheterize the acute prostatitis patient? One can try with a soft urethral silicone catheter, 12 number, very soft, gentle catheterization. But the textbook teaching and the classical urological teaching is that if there is prostatitis, to the SPC, the patient goes in retention. And because that also aids in urinary diversion. If we do PSA in this patient, it will be in hundreds and thousands because PSA rapidly increases in infection. And one of the commonest causes on the other end of the spectrum, you see one patient, a gentleman 65 years old with BPH, coming with elevated PSA, suddenly all of us run PSA. One must suspect prostatitis and UTI. So PSA is a very sensitive indicator when it comes to infection. So treatment is same like with quinolone, cephalosporins, and nitrofurantoin. In patients who have bladder obstruction, we need to give them definite treatment in the form of laser enucleation of prostate or TURP if the patient is having prostatic obstruction. Now, what is the role of prophylaxis? Do we give prophylaxis to every patient? No. It is indicated after 2 or more documented separate episodes of cystitis or pyelonephritis. It is to be given in patients who have gross urological abnormality. Let's say a patient of reflux, a child of reflux, who has one episode of UTI. Then you have to give them long term to prevent recurrent UTI. A patient who has had previous history of 2 or more investigations. And importantly, a patient who is again is pregnant, is immunocompromised, or in some times in diabetic patients where Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadashiv. You have done an excellent job of describing a very vast topic into a comprehensive lecture. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Yes, good. A couple of things. One is that, as you all know, that there are three groups. One is the young girls, second is the young newly married girls, and postmenopausal women. These are the three groups where the urinary tract infection is pretty common. Young girls usually
Yes.
have a vesicoureteral reflux. The young girls who recently are married are sexually active and they get postcoital infection or honeymoon cystitis.
Yes.
And the third group,
Yes.
which is very common, that is postmenopausal
Yes.
women who
Yes.
invariably get recurrent urinary tract infection. I always
Yes.
say that we are not going to treat urine reports. We are going to treat the patients. As you have mentioned in your topic, in your talk, that do not treat asymptomatic pyuria or bacteria. There are so many women who come to us with 50, 60 pus cells in the urine, but they are totally asymptomatic, and do not treat a urine report, treat the patient. That is most important.
Yes.
Another thing that I would like to mention here is the acute emphysematous pyelonephritis, which is a
Yes.
severe condition, and we are called in to see, especially in the ICUs, a urologist is called in to see the patient with acute emphysematous pyelonephritis. And it has been shown that if you put a double J stent or if you drain the kidney, even if there is no hydronephrosis, the outcome is far better than not doing anything. Just by IV antibiotics, it may not help. And the third thing, as you have already mentioned about the acute prostatitis or urinary tract infection, the boys usually do not get infection unless they get it sexually transmitted or in a prostatic age group. Now, one more thing, one question that I have is about fosfomycin, which has recently been introduced. I mean, it's been there for a while, but nowadays we are using it fairly commonly. What is your opinion about fosfomycin?
Sir, fosfomycin was the drug which was US FDA approved for over-the-counter sales in the United States in women who are having UTI. So the US FDA was clear in that guidelines that it is for women with recurrent UTI. The problem is now fosfomycin is one drug which has to be used with caution by us as clinicians, because it is the drug available for many patients who are resistant to meropenem. So higher antibiotic resistance are still sensitive to fosfomycin. So I never use fosfomycin as the first line therapy for any person. I would always try to conserve it as a emergency dependent antibiotic. So fosfomycin, I think, has to be used with caution, number one. Number two, the current guidelines of fosfomycin is for acute uncomplicated UTI. Uncomplicated in the sense that the patient does not have bladder outlet obstruction, does not have stone, does not have any urological abnormality, that is uncomplicated UTI. So a patient of uncomplicated UTI can have one stat dose of fosfomycin. In severe infection, we use fosfomycin on alternate days or once in 3 days. Because the half-life of fosfomycin is pretty long. So in these patients, it can be used. But nowadays, we have to restrict the use of fosfomycin in our clinical practice and use it for more severe cases, more refractory cases, or more sick patients. Some of our patients in ICUs, they were resistant to all antibiotics, but they were sensitive to fosfomycin, and the life-saving drug in them was fosfomycin. There is one point I have to make. The second, you rightly mentioned about emphysematous pyelonephritis. We have seen a paradigm shift in the treatment of emphysematous pyelonephritis, because 15, 20 years back, when we were training as residents and we were practicing as young surgeons in the city, pyelonephritis was a warrant for doing a life-saving nephrectomy. So a patient who was in hypotension, severely compromised, diabetic, obese, and used to open that patient up in emergency at 8 o'clock at night and do a difficult pyelonephrectomy and save the life of the patient. But things have changed now, and there is current data which supports the use of deobstruction decompression by stenting or PCN in treatments of pyelonephritis, emphysematous pyelonephritis. Like emphysematous pyelonephritis, we also have emphysematous cystitis, where we have to catheterize the patient, treat it. And there are patients of emphysematous pyelonephritis we see in our day-to-day practice, which are extremely refractory, and literature reports emergency cystectomy undertaken with IL conduit for these patients who are having refractory emphysematous pyelonephritis. But the good news is that most of the patients are now amenable to good antibiotic treatment, good supportive treatment, and decompression. The third comment which you made about young women and also honeymoon cystitis. Honeymoon cystitis is one of the most terrifying and irritating conditions for the patient. And every time they have sex, after 2 days, they come with severe scalding pain, fever, and so much of infection. And it is something which makes their sexual personal life miserable. And it is something which is to be looked into with more details. And one has to examine the private parts of the patient, the external meatus. There was in Barcelona, in the European Congress, which last year, which was concluded Barcelona, there was a paper from the Russian group, and they evaluated these women, young women who had sexually induced UTI, and they saw that the meatus, instead of facing up in a lithotomy position, standard lithotomy position, the meatus was basically pointing down. So the shape, the direction of the meatus is something which is very important in 40 to 50% of the patients. And they had a treatment therapy where they used to inject hyaluronidase to bulk up the meatus from below. And they found very good results with hyaluronidase injection in these patients, young women with this infective honeymoon cystitis and sexually induced infections. Now, these are, I'm not saying these are sexually transmitted infections. These are sexually induced infections. There's a difference between the two. Sexually induced infection occurs because of microtrauma at the vaginal and the periurethral region because of sexual intercourse. And that basically results in meatitis, urethritis, and flamboyant cystitis and infection. So, sexual transmitted is slightly different. So, the third subset of the patient is patients who had menopause. So these patients are low estrogen level. They have what is we call as post-menopausal urethral syndrome, meatus stenosis. Many times they have obstruction. They come to us with retention, and in fact, in some women it is difficult to catheterize these patients. Men are more easy to catheterize than women inside. The stenosis is so severe. So these patients need very close follow-up. They need hormonal replacement therapy. If not systemic, then local hormonal treatment in the form of Evolon cream and so forth. And these are special subset of patients which really require very good treatment and close follow-ups.
Thank you very much, Sadashiv. You have done an excellent job. Now, I would ask the audience to ask their question. Try to be brief and to the point, because we should be able to accommodate more and more people.
Hello, Sadashiv.
Yes, sir.
I'm Dr. Sanjay Ghate, Chandrapur.
Yes, sir. Boliye.
Nice, usual, meticulous elaboration of the most common disease, not only to the urologist, but about the surgeons and gynecologists and even GPs also. Okay.
Yes, yes.
My questions are two. After the procedure of obstructive uropathy, we remove the obstruction and do the DJ stenting. Okay. And if some patient may have fever, not responding to any antibiotic, and we do culture, everything, and the moment we remove the stent, the fever is settled. So, can you highlight that?
Excellent question. Yes, it is paradoxical situation that in a patient of obstruction, but in a stented patient who comes with fever, we remove the stent, isn't it? So that is because of the phenomena of biofilm formation on the stent. Stent is a foreign body. Where we operated the patient and we have stented the patient, goes home, comes back up with and everything. So in these patients, it is always mandatory, or I would say good practice to immediately remove the stent, because this is a foreign body. This has been basically, there is a biofilm formation, and here unless you remove the stent, the antibiotic will not work effectively. If at all one finds the need that the patient needs to have a stent, then remove the old stent, put a new stent, and then treat the patient.
Okay, okay. When the purpose is not solved, the restenting is necessary.
Yes, sometimes, most of the time we put stent for drainage after the procedure. If you think that the drainage is adequate, there are no residual, patient does not have edema, please remove it. But then patient who has had a procedure, has a stent, comes back with infection, one has to remove that stent.
Okay.
Even patients on long catheterization who has a catheter, comes with fever, it is always a good practice to remove the old catheter, put a new one.
Okay.
We have a practice of sending, cutting the tip of the catheter and sending it for culture also to see whether it.
Got it, got it. And another question is about the interstitial cystitis, which has been highlighted much more. So can you throw some light?
Yes, interstitial cystitis is now a part of painful bladder syndrome, PBS, or it's called the bladder pain syndrome. Interstitial cystitis is not related to UTI. It is a different entity wherein the patient has severe pelvic pain. The pain is so severe that most of the patients are driven to end their life. The pain is so severe. One of the most painful conditions in urology. Second thing is, now it is grouped as a painful bladder syndrome, or what was initially called as pelvic pain syndrome. So it is a painful condition where there is inflammation of the layers of bladder. There is a decrease in the capacity of the bladder. There are interstitial hemorrhages inside interstitial hemorrhages. We call them glomerulations in technical language. And there is Hanna's ulcer possible. Patient has severe frequency. Patient goes to urinate every 5 to 6 minutes. They spend their night sitting in the bathroom on the commode or sleeping on in their bathroom because they have so much of frequency. And with pain, there is exacerbation remission. So the patient's symptoms will increase and remission will occur. Now, this is a diagnosable exclusion. We have to exclude around 30 different kind of diagnosis before diagnosing this condition. We have to do cystoscopy under either general anesthesia or spinal anesthesia. See the capacity of the bladder to see glomerulations and Hanna's ulcer. So that is diagnostic of this particular phenomenon. Capacity of the bladder less than 2 meters, 220 glomerulations and Hanna's ulcer. And the patient is treated on various lines. The two specific drugs we use for treatment of the patients are pentazone sulfate, and second, which is marketed as a brand name of Comfora, and second is high doses of Tramadol. We also have to add Tramadol for pain, sometimes antidiarrheals for pain. And this is a condition which requires lifelong follow-up. There will be exacerbations and remissions. This is intravesical therapy for alleviating pain, intravesical instillation of drugs. There is pain therapy blocking the pain nerves by doing a block by pain specialist. And the final treatment is a surgical treatment where the complete bladder, including the trigon, is removed, and we create artificial bladder by doing a scuderia bladder and completely removing the bladder. That is the only thing which alleviates pain in severe conditions.
Okay, thank you, Sudhashi.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for these beautiful questions. Now, what I'll do is I'll get the audience one by one.
Yeah.
I have one question before that because I'll take a privilege. So, sir, many times it happens that we do cholecystectomy or appendectomy in the evening, afternoon, and in the night, patient has not passed urine. So the ward house officer usually, without informing us, sometimes puts nail cath and drains out the urine in the night. I personally don't like putting a nail cath. I always tell them put a catheter. So what's your opinion on that?
Yes.
Should a nail cath under sterile condition is okay, or you should always catheterize?
Melcap is out. Melcap can cause severe, we have seen urethral Melcap with the same technique, where the resident medical officer tried to catheterize, the patient had a prostate median lobe, then he forced it, and then there was tear. Now remember one thing, the softest catheter, you need drainage at the middle of the night, you don't need a problem. So the best thing to drain it temporarily is a number 8 or number 10 infant feeding tube. It is sterile, it is soft, it can go in the narrows of the ureters, and it has very less chances of basically causing an injury. So ask them to put an infant feeding tube at night. If at all they have to put a catheter, always train your staff how to put a Foley's catheter, because some of the worst complications are created while putting a Foley's catheter. And a patient of cholecystitis will never have gallbladder stones again. But once you give him a stricture, he will constantly curse that particular doctor for giving him that stricture. So the most important point is a very liberal lubrication of urethra while putting the catheter. That is very important. All 20 kg of the baby has to be put inside. Then putting a soft catheter. Do not put a big catheter, put a 12 or 14 French catheter. Silicone catheter is better. If these facilities were not available in the setup, putting in a number 10 infant tube and securing it with a micropore to the precocious skin or to the penile skin till the time being, till the morning comes, is the best bet.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
Dr. V.N. Srikhande always used to say, do not lubricate the catheter, lubricate the urethra. That is most important. You must inject the jelly into the urethra. Do not just apply थूक लगा के catheter डाला, ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए.
Correct. Yes, sir.
और इसमें skill लगता है, because you know, put the jelly also you need to properly hold up meatus, the glands, put the tube properly. It takes time and it takes effort, but it should be kind of a practice routine where because the conservation is unfortunately, even in a city like us, which we are medically much advanced than many other cities in the country, still we find that the urethra, the Foley balloon commonly was inflated in the prostatic urethra. Very common problem, and it caused such a rupture of the urethra, bad condition. So if they are inexperienced, you ask them to put Foley's, do not inflate the balloon. Foley's डाल के रखो, urine आने दो, urine को fix करके रखो, 10 मिनट पकड़ के रखो, आने दो. Foley's balloon has to be inflated only when you see a clear drip of urine dripping out of the Foley's. This should be a standard, and this should be absolutely gold standard written on every wall in every ward in ICU.
Understood. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, we have Swanand Chaudhary sir online, but as we had decided, sir, Swanand sir, you are online. You're listening to us. Swanand sir, please speak up. Hello. So he is online, but I guess his voice is still not there. Okay, I'll take questions. First question is from Dr. Dasgupta sir. I'll open his mic. Yeah, Dasgupta sir, please go ahead, sir, with your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I can.
Yeah, Sadasiv, a very nice talk indeed. And
Thank you.
one of my observations is that every patient who has been diagnosed UTI, apart from antibiotics, is always prescribed a bottle of alkaline citral, alkaline mixture. So I want to know, I want you to highlight what is the importance of monitoring of pH and specific gravity of urine in a patient of UTI.
Sir, basically pH and specific gravity are important to the sense that, see, alkaline mixture is given as a line prescription today, but most of the antibiotics do well in the acidic pH of the urine. So a acidic pH of the urine is better in treatment of UTI. Now, when we think of diagnosing tuberculosis, we always used to say that pyurine and acidic pH of urine. So pH is important. pH will give you some degree of idea about the grade of infection. However, in clinical practice today, we don't pay too much attention to pH because we bombard the patient with so much of antibiotic. Everything that, to be very frank with you, in contrast to the traditional teaching, we have lost the importance of pH. and we are giving anyway alkaline mixture to everybody, so it doesn't make any sense. Nitrofuran then works when it is given without alkaline mixture.
Yes, yes, certainly. And what about specific gravity?
Specific gravity tells you whether the patient is having a severe pyuria and phosphaturia, because that will increase the specific gravity of the urine. So again, as I told you that when we treat infection day in and day out, unfortunately today we have lost the importance of these two parameters in urine.
No, why is it said so that if the urine in acidic make alkaline and if it is alkaline make acidic, does it really help?
It depends. See, if you're talking about an infection like Pseudomonas. So Pseudomonas is basically an infection of alkaline urine. If you make acidic, then the Pseudomonas infection will be less virulent. And in long-term treatment strategies also, particularly in patients who are having storage stones, we advise patients to have acidic urine. Because in these patients, alkaline urine, these Pseudomonas grow more. On the other spectrum is when we are using drugs like nitrofurantoin or quinolones, they basically are secreted inside, they are secreted in the urine and secreted in the system and the bladder. Here, if we give alkaline mixture, or we say Cital or Nocula, whatever we give, then that causes a problem, particularly in the efficiency of that particular antibiotic on long-term basis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sadashiv.
Next, yeah.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sadashiv, what's the reason nowadays B6 is added to the alkaline mixture?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
That has got nothing to do with UTI. B6 addition is for long-term prevention of
Long-term prevention now.
stones.
Okay.
It is given to patients of recurrent calculi on long-term use ranging from 10 months to 15 months. And B6 magnesium are inhibitors of stone aggregation and formation. So they are given. B6 has nothing to do with UTI.
Yes.
Sir, next question is from Dr. Nilesh Junankar, sir. Nilesh, sir.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Wonderful talk, Sadashiv.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have answered all the questions. I have raised my hand just to congratulate you. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question. We have question from Paradeep Arora, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Sadashiv Bhole.
Evening, sir. Good evening.
The panelist has asked to give, brief comments. So I am allowed to use only one adjective for your talk. So I have chosen the word fantabulous. Is it okay?
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
And hurriedly, I must also say that you're looking very dashing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now the question.
Yes,
The
sir.
question is that I have heard about this. Actually, your voice is a little muffled today. So it's not coming through very clearly. Maybe you have mentioned, and still I am finding out. So excuse me for that, in case that is true. But there is some talk about Canberry, capsules, Canberry this thing.
Yes.
And so, what is your opinion about this? And if there is it is a hoax or it really works, and if it works,
Yes.
in that case, it's due to the fact that it contains polyphenols, which are seen in tea, coffee, and wine also. Would it be right to say that we can indulge ourselves and also keep the UTI away?
No, sir. No. When we use there are case control studies which definitely give a very scientific data that cranberry works. It works by basically preventing the gram-negative bacteria by attaching themselves. Gram-negative bacteria attach with the phyla. So this adhesion, the electrolyte is basically prevented by cranberry. Now, the phenols which you get in wine and alcohol, that indulgence will not save the person from the protective cranberry juice. There are no studies which say that drinking a pint of beer every day prevents UTI. But we have now good products available. See, it is very difficult to get cranberry juice on a daily basis. We have certain sachets available which are combination of D-mannose, cranberry. And we have tablets available which have got hibiscus extract. So hibiscus extract, D-mannose and cranberry definitely have a role in aiding antibiotic use, in long-term prophylaxis, and in preventing long-term recurrent urinary tract infections.
Sadashiv, about the cranberry extract, the cranberry
Yes.
thing usually works on the pili of the bladder mucosa. It does not allow the bacteria to adhere to the pili. And
Yes.
that is how it works, and that is why it has been proved. In fact, in the underground trains in London, they would say you have cystitis, drink cranberry juice, and that is what it has been proved beyond doubt that it is extremely useful, especially if you have a recurrent UTI. And as far as the pH of the urine is concerned, nitrofurantoin works well in acidic urine rather than in an alkaline urine.
Yes,
And
yes.
to make an urine alkaline, you have to literally take liters of alkaline mixture. So taking 10 ml of say Cital or any other Alka-Citral or anything would probably not make much of difference to the pH of the urine.
Yes, yes. But nitrofurantoin works in acidic pH. Yes.
Okay. Okay, Yogesh, second question is allowed today?
Yes, yes.
Is
Yeah,
there
go ahead, sir. There are less number of questions, so you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Sadashiv, one comment. You said while talking about blood sugar in investigations that
Yes.
you said at length, I suppose. Again, I didn't hear clearly, but you're saying that sometimes it is missed. Patient may be hypoglycemia. Single reading is not important. You should repeat it just to make sure when the index of suspicion is high, and so on and so on. So my take is that you should always do glycosylated hemoglobin as well.
I told I mean,
Did you mention that?
yes, yes.
Glycosylated hemoglobin should
Yes.
also be done. Your index of suspicion is high regarding diabetes. That was by way of comment. Now,
Yes.
another question is that you said that this UTI has to be necessarily bacteriological, right? Right
Yes.
at the outset, when you defined it, you said it has to be bacteriological. Am I right? It has to be bacterial infection. Yeah. Where do you place Candida infection?
That is a textbook. By definition, UTI is an inflammatory response of bacterium to a uropathogen. The uropathogen can be bacteria, can be fungus also at times.
Can be fungus also. Okay. You didn't mention carbuncle. Hello, carbuncle.
Carbuncle is yes. It is a type of infection. Basically it is localization of infection around the pericapsular area, and it requires drainage. Percutaneous drainage has made the treatment of carbuncle very easy.
Okay. Yes, my questions are finished. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for your.
Glycosylated, and I would like to mention one or two of my cases where the patient was absolutely normal. We had one was a female, one was male patient. They came with urinary infection, and when we did their blood sugar was 10, 12, 13. We rechecked, and patient was absolutely asymptomatic. And this occurs in a very typical case of severe gram-negative sepsis. But surprisingly, these patients did not have hypertension. They were eating well. They were only feeling malaise. And every time when we did that sugar, we have documented all those two cases there, and they basically responded only to antibiotic treatment. So this is something severe hypoglycemic, low blood sugar reading without symptoms to the patient. Always suspect severe urinary infection in such patients.
Thank you, sir. We have next question from Dr. Kapil Annaldevar. Kapil, Dr. Kapil, you are online. Please unmute your mic. Okay, he's not there. Next question is from Dr. Vikas. Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, Kapil,
Hello.
go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Dr. Bhole, sir.
Good evening, Kapil.
And it was a very wonderful lecture to hear, sir. I have one specific question. You mentioned about the PVR, importance of PVR. I just have one question, that how does the PVR need to be always correlated with the pre-void and pre-void volume? Does it always need a correlation? And how do you correlate it?
Yes. Normally, Kapil, see, we talk about two scenarios. One, where the patient is having urinary tract infection, and other when the patient is a normal patient coming to your OPD. Normally, we say that if post-void residue is more than 1/3 of the pre-void residue, we call it as significant PVR. These are arbitrary figures. These are not very well-defined, well-controlled surgical definitions. These are arbitrary figures. More than 1/3 hai, so then it is significant. Less than 1/3, so it is not significant. That is for a patient who is not having urinary infection. Now, in a patient with sepsis with UTI, even 50 cc is significant. That is where the stasis of the urine is. That is where the bacteria is multiplying, and that will not be taken care of by only antibiotics. We have to catheterize this patient.
Okay.
Sir, next question is from Dr. Vikas Jain, sir. Vikas, sir, go ahead. Your question.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Hello. Good evening, sir. So my question is, commonly in post-operative cases, or sometime during the UTI with pregnancy, or sometime in diabetic patient, we have to give long-term antibiotic. In such case, we are using cephalosporin, most commonly cefuroxime, or sometime levofloxacin or nitrofurantoin for long-term use. And after some time, we see there is resistance with this antibiotic, but the patient doesn't have any symptoms, and patient doesn't have any fever. So should we change the antibiotic, or should we continue with the same antibiotic? And what is your choice of antibiotic to continue for long term?
See, long-term antibiotics, basically the drugs which we prefer is quinolones, that is one group, levofloxacin, ofloxacin commonly. Then the other group is nitrofurantoin. These are for long-term use in urinary tract. As you rightly said, cephalosporins, but cephalosporins cannot be given for long term because of their effect on the bowel flora, and in females on the vaginal flora. So too long cephalosporin can cause problems with bowel flora as well as vaginal flora. So cephalosporins are basically not very ideal in long-term management. However, they can be given, particularly we give in low-dose antibiotic prophylaxis in children. Sulfanaxin we give. That is one thing. Now, the second part of your question is that the patient is asymptomatic and should we continue the same treatment? If the patient was symptomatic in the first treatment part when he came to you and he became asymptomatic, he remained asymptomatic, and you are giving him low-dose suppression antibiotic, then you have to see the end point. The end point is that if this patient is among that subspecialty of the patient which I am again and again mentioning, that the patient is diabetic, pregnant, immunocompromised, or a sick patient, or with implants, you need a negative culture on these patients. You cannot only say that the patient is asymptomatic. So in these patients, you have to change antibiotic and completely take care of these bacteria in the urine. In other patients, where the patient is asymptomatic, he's not among these subspecialty of patient, you should not change it, you should continue the same antibiotic for a month or so.
Sir, in a patient of post-TURP patient with sepsis, sometimes patient came with retention with urosepsis, we control the sepsis and we operate for TURP. Post-operative, how long should we continue the antibiotic?
Post-operative, I continue the antibiotic till either empirically if you are giving for at least 14 days, I give antibiotic. In combination of quinolone for 14 days or nitrofurantoin. Or IV is always quinolone or nitrofurantoin, never together. With that, I add 5 days of cephalosporin. When the patient is in there for first 2 days, we give injectable and then we shift it to oral. And That is my usual practice. But in a patient with a documented UTI, culture was positive. The culture
Positive.
end of it. So document that the culture is negative. Interest patients, particularly for post-operative patients.
If they consecutive two culture negative, then we can stop the antibiotic.
Yes.
Hello?
And
Okay,
one culture should be there. One good culture should be negative at the end of your therapy. And
in post-PC,
in patients who are diabetics, levofloxacin can cause severe refractory hypoglycemia in these patients. So try to
Okay,
avoid, in patients who are diabetics as far as possible. And if all you have to give, try to avoid levofloxacin. It causes severe hypoglycemia. We have seen it in our patients.
sir, which is better antibiotic, Moxiclav or the quinolone, Moxiclav versus cephalosporin? Because in most of the culture, we see Moxiclav as a choice of antibiotic, but Moxiclav is not urinary excrete through urine. So they
Yes,
says it is not better.
I showed you in my slides also that the cephalosporin technically has got an upper edge, as rightly you have mentioned that it is secreted in the urine. But if you look at the areas and the hospitals you practice, you have a typical kind of sensitivity reports of that area. Suppose if you are practicing in a hospital, corporate hospital in Mumbai, if you are in Nagpur, if you are in Gondia, then if you see the culture report over a period of time, the reports are slightly different. So in your setup, if you are getting a culture which says that it is sensitive to amoxiclav, then amoxiclav can be given. It is not that only, but you also have to correlate the in vitro sensitivity with your clinical evaluation. Like if you are starting patients on amoxiclav and if you are finding that the antibiotic is working clinically, then that culture report has more significance. Rather than, see, in vitro is different and in clinical is different. In vitro guides you to a particular antibiotic therapy. Suppose you are giving amoxiclav for 2-3 days, in 3-4 patients have seen the cephalosporin चालू करने की तो इसका fever ही हो जाता है. So then clinically you have to make that adjustment.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Sir, if moderator allow, can I ask one or two more clinical question similar to this?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sir, in a patient of post PCNL with DJ stenting, should you continue antibiotic till the stent is there, or can we stop the antibiotic? Or if the stent is
yes, there are several reasons for it. One important reason is that the stone itself is made up of bacteria. We know that when the stone is fragmented, bacteria are released, and this can cause bacterial infection. Number one. Number two, because of the stone and because of the procedure and surgery, there can be local edema and obstruction, partial obstruction. So the stent not only gives you a good drainage, immediate decrease of the pressure on the peripheral system and kidney, which also prevents stasis. And as you know, stasis is most dangerous part of infection. So we usually keep the catheter DJ-stent in our patients of PCNL ranging from 10 days to 14 days. And during this time, we give antibiotic. When we call the patients of stent treatment, that time we don't give injectable in all patients unless the patient is high risk category. We remove the stent, then we put him on 5 days of treatment additionally. So on an average, a patient with PCNL with stenting takes around 20 days to 21 days of therapy of antibiotic.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one more. What is the role of single dose antibiotic? Like aminoglycoside, usually we avoid in the case of it is best antibiotic for urinary tract infection, but usually we avoid in post-surgical patient or a patient with early ARF. So, what is the role of single dose? Can we give?
Aminoglycosides are the mainstay of treatment of urological practice. We give aminoglycosides in patients who have renal insufficiency. There we can give by altering the dose. Now, most of the people have stopped giving aminoglycosides in these renal insufficiency patients because of the medical legal ethics. Because they don't understand that we can titrate the dose as per the requirement. Number one. Number two thing about aminoglycosides, which I want to tell you is that aminoglycosides should be given in a single dose. There is no rationale of giving gentamicin 60 mg 3 times a day or 80 mg 2 times a day or aminoglycosis 500 milligrams 2 times a day. There's no answer. If you look at the pharmacology of aminoglycosides, these are drugs which work because of cumulative effect. So if you give 500 milligram, that doesn't mean the plasma level is reached and the antibiotic will start killing the bacteria. No, they have cumulative effect. All aminoglycosides work by cumulative effect. So if you are giving low doses, then the treatment, the actual effect of the antibiotic will start not on 24 hours, it will start after 48 hours, because you are not giving adequate dose, you are giving small doses. Think that it will cause nephrotoxicity or ototoxicity. But believe me, if you read the pharmacology, aminoglycosides, the effect is also cumulative, its toxicity is also cumulative. So, in my opinion, I don't understand the nephrological rationale of giving 750 milligrams. I don't know where they got 750 from. There is no documentation of 750. You know the dose. Aminoglycoside is what dose 15 milligram per kg body weight, right? So if the maximum dose allowed is 15 milligram per kg body weight per day. So if you calculate as per the weight, maximum doses should be given once every day, instead of splitting it into 3 doses. Don't think that splitting will decrease the toxicity. No, toxicity and effect, they are cumulative. And there is nothing like 50 milligram aminoglycosides. This is a concept which is brought on by scientific, but I did not see any literature report. 750, I don't know 750 single dose. ऐसा नहीं है. Ideal रहे कि बच्चा रहे, dose should be according to the weight, and the maximum dose of aminoglycoside usually is 1 gram. So you should not exceed 1 gram. But giving 750 empirically is also not correct.
What we follow is 15 milligram per kg per day.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I think you solved all my queries. Thank you, sir. It was nice to talk to you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So we have a last question now from Dr. Ashok Gajbia, sir.
Thanks.
Ashok sir, you are online, sir. Ashok sir. So he is not coming up. So I'll ask my panelists just to give concluding comments, and then we'll close up the session. Yeah, Ashok sir is there. Ashok sir is there.
Good evening, sir. No. I want to ask one question. What is the difference between sexually transmitted infection and sexually infected infection? And
we say sexually induced because in immune cystitis particularly, or in women who have started getting sexual infection because of sexual intercourse, it is not necessary that husband also should be a carrier of a bacterial infection. We say sexually transmitted when for disease like pneumonia, chlamydia, syphilis, etc., etc., where the patient's sexual partner has an infection and he transmits sexually to the partner. In that patient, even when the husbands are normal or the micro abrasions which occur or micro which occur in the area, so other these patients can have infection. And infections can be gonococcal infection. Their infection which can occur with the same E. coli again and again and again. So this is the difference between sexually and sexually transmitted. These are two different categories.
okay, thank you. Nice presentation, Sadaji.
Thank you.
Sir, Alpekar sir and Sanjay sir, last comments from you, and then I'll.
Yeah. Thank you, Sadashiv. You have done an excellent job. You have done justice to the topic. Okay.
Thank you.
Only one point of note that I would like to make is about the levofloxacin. You have said that in the diabetics you have to be extremely careful while giving. Same thing is true for neurological patients. Most of the neurologists do not like to give levofloxacin.
Yes, because of seizures.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that is the reason you have to be careful while giving levofloxacin. Third point is that in MDR, that is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis.
Yes,
So you try to save this particular drug, that is the levofloxacin, for those people with MDR rather than giving it routinely for UTI or any other thing. So you have to be
Yes.
extremely careful while giving a levofloxacin. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Even patients who are having no previous history of seizures, levofloxacin administration can land a patient in a epileptic fit. That is one.
Correct.
Second
Yep.
thing is levoflox for tuberculosis. But if you see that it is specific for tuberculosis, but even when there are papers which say that even when criminals use other criminals like moxifloxacin, refloxacin, they belong to the same group, and we are decreasing the efficiency of levofloxacin in India. However, levofloxacin and criminals, unfortunately, because they are the mainstay of treatment of urinary tract infection and prophylaxis as well. So we really have to balance this out very judiciously.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sadashiv, Dr. Sanjay Ghatu here. Hello.
Yeah,
Yes.
Sanjay sir.
Hello. Dr. Sanjay Ghatu here.
हाँ बोलो.
Urinary tract infection what is
all the doctors. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, sir. We have
Thank
lot
you
of
again.
disturbance today.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Yeah, close of the session, sir. Thank you, Bole sir. Thank you, Salpekar sir and Sanjay Ghate sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Yogesh.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I will continue with Dr. Chaudhary sir so that I can make his thing happen for next time. You can switch off.
Okay.
Yeah, you can exit the webinar.
12 plus 6.
Yeah. Swanand sir. Swanand sir, can you listen to me?
18. 18 plus 3. 19, 20, 21.
Swanand sir. स्वानंद सर आप सुन रहे हो सर मुझे?
Yogesh?
Yes sir.
Yogesh, are you keeping Dr. Swanand's webinar just now or later on?
No, not now. I'm just checking his connection so that next time there is no problem.
Yeah. You keep it. The topic is also very important.
Yes sir, we are going to keep it. Next time we'll surely do it. That's why I asked everyone to switch off their connection and they can close off. I'll be only with online with you. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah. Swanand sir. Swanand sir, can you listen to me? Swanand sir, you are online? Hello? Is not online. Jan.